Clutching his broken glasses to his face, Harry stared around. He had emerged in a dingy alleyway that seemed to be made up entirely of shops devoted to the dark arts. The one he'd just left, Borgin and Burke's, looked like the largest, but opposite was a nasty window display of shrunken heads, and 2 doors down, a large cage was alive with gigantic black spiders. 2 shabby-looking wizards were watching him from the shadow of the doorway, muttering to each other. Feeling jumpy, Harry set off, trying to hold his glasses on straight and hoping against hope he'd be able to find a way out of there. An old wooden sign hanging over a shop selling poisonous candles told him he was in Knockturn Alley. This didn't help, as Harry had never heard of such a place. He supposed he hadn't spoken clearly enough through his mouth full of ashes back in the Weasley's fire. Trying to stay calm, he wondered what to do. "Not lost, are you, my dear?" said a voice in his ear, making him jump. An aged witch stood in front of him, holding a tray of what looked horribly like whole human fingers. She leered at him, showing mossy teeth. Harry backed away. "I'm fine, thanks," he said. "I'm just..." "Harry, what do you think you're doing down there?" Harry's heart leapt. So did the witch. A load of fingernails cascaded down over her feet, and she cursed as the massive form of Hagrid, the Hogwarts gamekeeper, came striding towards them, beetle black eyes flashing over his great bristling beard. "Hagrid!" Harry croaked in relief. "I was lost! Flue powder!" Hagrid seized Harry by the scruff of the neck, pulled him away from the witch, knocking the tray right out of her hands. Her shrieks followed them all the way along the twisting alleyways out into bright sunlight. Harry saw a familiar snow-white marble building in the distance, Gringotts Bank. Hagrid had steered him right into Diagon Alley. "You're a mess," said Hagrid gruffly, brushing soot off Harry so forcefully he nearly knocked him into a barrel of dragon dung outside an apothecary. "Sulking around Knockturn Alley? I don't know. Dodgy place, Harry. Don't want no one to see you down there." "I realize that," said Harry, ducking as Hagrid made to brush him off again. "I told you I was lost. What were you doing down there anyway?" "I was looking for a flesh-eating slug repellent," growled Hagrid. "They're ruining the school cabbages. You're not on your own." "I'm staying with the Weasleys and we got separated," Harry explained. "I got to go and find them." They set off together down the street. "How come you never wrote back to me?" said Hagrid as Harry jogged alongside him. He had to take 3 steps to every stride of Hagrid's enormous boots. Harry explained all about Dobby and the Dursleys. "Lousy muggles," growled Hagrid. "If I'd known." Harry, over here!" Harry looked up and saw Hermione Granger standing on top of the white flight of steps to Gringotts. She ran down to meet them, her bushy brown hair flying behind her. "What happened to your glasses?" "Hello, Hagrid. Oh, it's wonderful to see you two again. Are you coming into Gringotts, Harry?" "As soon as I've found the Weasleys," said Harry. "You won't have to wait," Hagrid said with a grin. Harry and Hermione looked around. Sprinting up the crowded street were Ron, Fred, George, Percy, and Mr. Weasley. "Harry!" Mr. Weasley panted. "We'd hoped you'd only gone 1 grade too far." He mopped his glistening bald patch. "Molly's frantic. She's coming now." "Where did you come out?" Ron asked. "Knockturn Alley," said Hagrid grimly. "Excellent," said Fred and George together. "We've never been allowed in," said Ron cautiously. "I should ruddy well think not," growled Hagrid. Mrs. Weasley now came galloping into view, her handbag swinging wildly in one hand, Ginny just clinging into the other. "Oh, Harry! Oh, my dear! You could have been anywhere!" Gasping for breath, she pulled a large cloth brush out of her bag and began sweeping off the soot Hagrid hadn't managed to beat away. Mr. Weasley took Harry's glasses, gave them a tap with his wand, and returned them, good as new. "Well, got to be off," said Hagrid, who was having his hand wrung by Mrs. Weasley. "Knockturn Alley, if you hadn't have found him, Hagrid." "See you at Hogwarts," and he strode away, head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the packed streets. "Guess who I saw at Borgin and Burke's," Harry said to Ron and Hermione as they climbed the Gringotts steps. "Malfoy and his father." "Did Lucius Malfoy buy anything?" said Mr. Weasley sharply behind them. "No, he was selling." "So he's worried," said Mr. Weasley with a grin of satisfaction. "Oh, I'd love to get Lucius Malfoy for something." "You be careful, Arthur," said Mrs. Weasley sharply as they were bowing into the bank by a goblin at the door. "That family's trouble. Don't go biting off more than you can chew." "So you don't think I'm a match for Lucius Malfoy?" said Mr. Weasley indignantly. But he was distracted almost at once by the sight of Hermione's parents, who were standing nervously at the counter that ran along the great marble hall, waiting for Hermione to introduce them. "But you're Muggles?" said Mr. Weasley delightedly. "We must have a drink. What's that you've got there? Oh, you're changing Muggle money? Molly, look!" He pointed excitedly to the 10-pound note that Mr. Granger handed in Mr. Granger's hand. "Meet you back here," said Ron to Hermione as the Weasleys and Harry were led off to the underground vaults by another Gringotts goblin. The vaults were reached by means of a small goblin-driven carts that sped along miniature train tracks through the bank's underground tunnels. Harry enjoyed the breakneck journey down to the Weasleys' vault, but felt dreadful, far worse than he had in Knockturn Alley. When it was open, there was a very small pile of silver sickles inside and just one gold galleon. Mrs. Weasley felt right into the corners before sweeping the whole lot into her bag. Harry felt even worse when they reached his vault. He tried to block the contents from view as he hastily shoved handfuls of coins into a leather bag. Back outside on the marble steps, they all separated. Percy muttered vaguely about needing a new quill. Fred and George had spotted their friend from Hogwarts, Lee Jordan. Mrs. Weasley and Ginny were going to a second-hand robe shop. Mr. Weasley was insisting on taking the Grangers off to the Leaky Cauldron for a drink. "We'll all meet at Flourish and Bott's in an hour to buy your school books," said Mrs. Weasley, setting off with Ginny. "And not one step down Knockturn Alley," she shouted to the twins, retreating back. Harry, Ron, and Hermione strolled off along the winding cobblestone streets, the bag of gold, silver, and bronze jangling cheerfully in Harry's pocket was clamoring to be spent, so he brought 3 large strawberry and peanut butter ice creams, which they slurped happily as they wandered up the alley, examining the fascinating window shops. Ron gazed longingly at a full set of Chudley cannon robes in the windows of quality Quidditch supplies until Hermione dragged them off to buy ink and parchment next door. And Gamble and Jape's Wizarding Joke Shop, they met Fred, George, and Lee Jordan, who were stocking up on Dr. Filibuster's famous Wet Start, no heat fireworks. And in a tiny junk shop full of broken wands, lopsided brass scales, and old cloaks covered in potion stains, they found Percy deeply immersed in a small and deeply boring book called Perfects Who Gained Power. "A study of Hogwarts perfects and their later careers," Ron read aloud off the back cover. "That sounds fascinating." "Go away," Percy snapped. "Course he's very ambitious. Percy, he's got it all planned out. He wants to be Minister of Magic," Ron told Harry and Hermione in an undertone as they left Percy to it. An hour later, they headed to Flourish and Bott's. They were by no means the only ones making their way to the bookshops. As they approached it, they saw, to their surprise, a large crowd jostling outside the doors, trying to get in. The reason for this was proclaimed by a large banner stretched across the upper windows. "Gilderoy Lockhart will be signing copies of his autobiography, Magical Me, Today, 12:30 to 4:30. We can actually meet him? Hermione squealed. I mean, he's written almost the whole book list. The crowd seemed to be made up of mostly witches around Mrs. Weasley's age. A harassing-looking wizard stood at the door, saying, "Calmly, ladies, please. Don't push there. Mind the books now." Harry, Ron, and Hermione squeezed inside. A long line wound around to the back of the shop, where Gilderoy Lockhart was signing his books. They each grabbed a copy of the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 2, and sneaked up the line to where the rest of the Weasleys were standing with Mr. and Mrs. Granger. "Oh, there you are, good," said Mrs. Weasley. She sounded breathless and kept patting her hair. "We'll be able to see him in a minute." Gilderoy Lockhart came slowly into view, seated at the table, surrounded by large pictures of his own face, all winking and flashing dazzling white teeth to the crowd. The real Lockhart was wearing robes of forget-me-not blue that exactly matched his eyes. His pointed wizard hat was set at a jaunty angle on his very wavy hair. A short, irritable-looking man was dancing around taking photographs with a large black camera that emitted puffs of purple smoke with every blinding flash. "Out of our way there," he said to Ron, moving back to get a better shot. "This is for the Daily Prophet." "Big deal," said Ron, rubbing his foot where the photographer stepped on it. Gilderoy Lockhart heard him. He looked up. He saw Ron, and then he saw Harry. He stared, and then he leapt to his feet and positively shouted, "It can't be Harry Potter!" The crowd parted, whispering excitedly. Lockhart dived forward, seized Harry's arms, and pulled him to the front. The crowd burst into applause. Harry's face burned as Lockhart shook his hand for the photographer, who clicked away madly, wafting thick smoke over the Weasleys. "Nice big smile, Harry," said Lockhart through his own gleaming teeth. "Together you and I will be on the front page." When he finally let go of Harry's hand, Harry could hardly feel his fingers. He tried to settle back over to the Weasleys, but Lockhart threw an arm around his shoulder and clamped him tightly to his side. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said loudly, waving for quiet. "What an extraordinary moment this is. The perfect moment for me to make a little announcement. I've been sitting on this for some time. When young Harry here stepped into Flourish and Blotts today, he only wanted to buy my autobiography, which shall be happy to present him free of charge." The crowd applauded again. "He had no idea," Lockhart continued, giving Harry a little shake that made the glasses slip to the end of his nose, "that he would shortly be getting much, much more than my book. Magical Me. He and his schoolmates, in fact, will be getting the real Magical Me. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I have a great pleasure and pride in announcing that this September I will be taking up post of Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." The crowd cheered and clapped, and Harry found himself being presented with the entire works of Gilderoy Lockhart. Staggering slightly under their weight, he managed to make his way out of the limelight to the edge of the room, where Ginny was standing next to her new cauldron. "You have these," Harry mumbled to her, tipping the books into her cauldron. "I'll buy my own." "Bet you loved that, didn't you, Potter?" said a voice Harry had no trouble recognizing. He straightened up and found himself face to face with Draco Malfoy, who was wearing his usual sneer. "Famous Harry Potter," said Malfoy. "Can't even go into a bookstore without making a front page." "Leave him alone. He didn't want that at all," said Ginny. It was the first time she had spoken in front of Harry. She was glaring at Malfoy. "Potter, you've got yourself a girlfriend," drawled Malfoy. Ginny went scarlet as Ron and Hermione fought their way over, both clutching stacks of Lockhart's books. "Oh, it's you," said Ron, looking at Malfoy as if he were something unpleasant on the sole of his shoes. Bet you're surprised to see Harry here, huh? Not as surprised as I am to see you in a shop, Weasley, retorted Malfoy. I suppose your parents will go hungry for a month to pay for all of this. Ron went as red as Ginny. He dropped the books into the cauldron too and started towards Malfoy, but Harry and Hermione grabbed the back of his jacket. Ron, said Mr. Weasley, struggling over with Fred and George. What are you doing? It's too crowded in here. Let's go outside. Well, 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 Arthur Weasley. It was Mr. Malfoy. He stood with his hand on Draco's shoulder, sneering in just the same way. Lucius, said Mr. Weasley, nodding coldly. Busy time at the ministry, I hear, said Mr. Malfoy. All those raids. I hope they're paying you overtime. He reached into Ginny's cauldron and extracted from amid the glossy Lockhart books a very old, very battered copy of A Beginner's Guide to Transformation. Obviously not, Mr. Malfoy said. Dear me, what's the use of being a disgrace in the name of wizards if they don't pay you well for it? Mr. Weasley flushed darker than either Ron or Ginny. We have a very different idea of disgraces to the name, Malfoy, he said. Clearly, said Mr. Malfoy. His pale eyes strained to Mr. and Mrs. Granger, who were watching apprehensively. The company you keep, Weasley. And I thought your family could sink no lower. There was a thud of metal as Ginny's cauldron went flying. Mr. Weasley had thrown himself at Mr. Malfoy, knocking him backwards into a bookshelf. Dozens of heavy spellbooks came thundering down on their heads. There was a yell of, "Get him, Dad!" from Fred or George. Mrs. Weasley was shrieking, "No, Arthur, no!" The crowd stampeded backwards, knocking more shelves over. "Gentlemen, please, please!" cried the assistant, and then louder than all, "Break it up there, gents, break it up!" Hagrid was wading towards them through the sea of books. In an instant, he had pulled Mr. Weasley and Mr. Malfoy apart. Mr. Weasley had a cut lip, and Mr. Malfoy had been hit in the eye by an encyclopedia of toadstools. He was still holding Ginny's old transformation book. He thrust it at her, his eye glimmering with malice. "Here, girl, take your book. It's the best your father can give you." Pulling himself out of Hagrid's grip, he beckoned to Draco and swept from the shop. "You should have ignored him, Arthur," said Hagrid, almost lifting Mr. Weasley off of his feet to straighten his robes. "Rotten to the core. The whole family. Everyone knows that. No Malfoy's worth listening to. Bad blood, that's what it is. Come on now, let's get out of here." The assistant looked as though he wanted to stop them from leaving, but he barely came up to Hagrid's wrist and seemed to think better of it. Then hurried up the street, the Grangers shaking with fright and Mrs. Weasley beside herself with fury. "A fine example you set for children. Brawling in public. What Gilderoy Lockhart must have thought." "He was pleased," said Fred. "Didn't you hear him as we were leaving? He was asking that bloke from the Daily Prophet if he'd be able to work the fight into his report. Said it was all publicity." But it was a subdued group that headed back to the fireside in the leaky cauldron, where Harry, the Weasleys, and all the shopping would be traveling back to the Burrow using Floo powder. They said goodbye to the Grangers, who were leaving the pub for the Muggle Street on the other side. Mr. Weasley started to ask them how the bus stops worked, but quickly stopped at the look on Mrs. Weasley's face. Harry took off his glasses and put them safely in his pocket before helping himself to the Floo powder. It definitely wasn't his favorite way to travel.